Janie Pachano spent 8 years in a residential school in Fort George, James Bay. But it took 70 years and the discovery of possible unmarked graves in Kamloops for her to finally open up about her experience.
When I heard about the discovery in BC, something happened, something broke.
And the wounds resurfaced.
I had seen kids being hit, slapped before. Never like that, never that violent. I didn't understand death at the time.
At the 2:15, we started getting calls too. And he said, "Oh, remember what happened?" So I think it opened up a lot of people's eyes.
Based on these testimonials and more, the Cree of James Bay will undertake ground searches around 2 former residential schools, a daunting task, which will reveal only part of what happened to Indigenous children who died in Quebec's residential school system.
Le nombre d'enfants qui ne sont pas revenus, officiellement, au Québec, c'est 38.
But there are more children who were displaced and deported. Children we went in search of. Chisasibi, it means Great River. It is the northernmost point in Quebec accessible by road. A few kilometers from there, a ferry leads to the island of Fort George, where the first 2 residential schools in Quebec were built in the 1930s. Janie Pachano attended St. Philip's, the Anglican residential school, for nearly a decade. Like her mother before her, who was part of the first class of children sent there.
She was very angry about it because she was 12 and she was used to being out on the land. Nobody had ever seen a residential school or lived in one. And she didn't want to go, but she had no choice.
Attendance at residential schools was mandatory for Indigenous children.
And she was telling me one time about working in the kitchen, and the food that they were asked to cook had maggots all over it. And they were told not to take them off, to put them in the pot. And so that's what they had to eat.
Still little and unaware of her mother's experience, Janie dreamed of attending school.
One of my cousins came back her first year, and she had this bright plaid dress on and shiny black shoes. And, oh, I want to look like that too.
But above all, she wanted to learn. She too would discover the harsh reality of residential schools.
We were constantly being reminded we were savages. We didn't. Ignorant savages, pagans. And if we didn't shape up, there was no hope for us. We got to believe it after a while.
And recently, the worst of memories resurfaced. At 10 years old, a child nearly died before her eyes.
And the first thing I thought of was that story about the girl I told. And even now, when I think about it, I realized I'm still not recovered from it.
It's a story that will take Janie some time to tell. Her testimony and that of others finally convinced the Cree of Chisasibi to undertake ground searches.
The survivors want us to go ahead. They know there were questionable activities. They want us to search specific areas.
But where to start? The available archives are incomplete at best. They reveal recurrent financial problems and lists of sick children, lots of sick children, some admitted to residential schools with tuberculosis. But the archives make no mention of where children may be buried.
La première école a ouvert les portes en 1930. On est 2022. C'est presque 100 ans. Puis il n'y a pas beaucoup de survivants qui peuvent nous dire qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en 1930, 40, 50. Il n'y a pas beaucoup.
George Pachano is part of a group of survivors collecting stories from his community's elders. He was 6 years old when he first entered St. Philip's.
We all felt homesick, but after a while, you feel abandoned, eh? Like, how come they put us here? Because it's not what I expected. So it was pretty hard in there. So you had to protect yourself.
The history of Fort George is unique in Canada. Catholics and Anglicans competed for students to convert them, but primarily for the government subsidies they provided. Children were brought in from as far as Mishtiuyats, 1,000 kilometers away. Many disturbing stories stem from the Catholic residential school outside the village.
There was a basement, and there was no concrete floor, so it was just a dirt floor.
The building no longer exists, but numerous stories have surfaced about the secrets possibly buried in its basement.
There's one story that I heard that somebody saw crosses in there, people bringing flowers down there. So they assumed there were burial grounds, graves. But if you're 5, 6-year-old, you don't really grasp everything. It's only later on that when you think back and say, oh, maybe this happened.
Of the Catholic institution, there remains today only a cemetery, possibly that of the infirmary. 2 rows of crosses, 20 names or so, of which we know little. But there might be more burial sites, according to some elders.
He said there was an epidemic one time, and you really should check. I heard there is a grave somewhere, like where they put them all, like one grave, like a mass grave.
There are 16 confirmed deaths in Fort George, 6 from the Catholic school, 10 from the Anglicans. The testimonials may lead to more discoveries. Already, 5 potential sites have been identified on the island for ground searches.
Si on ne se fie que aux écrits, et de plus en plus on n'aura accès qu'à des écrits, on va avoir des soucis. Donc il y a vraiment les témoignages des anciens pensionnaires qui sont primordiaux, parce que c'est ça qui va nous permettre de mieux mettre en perspective tout ce qu'on va mettre du temps à analyser.
Le temps presse.
Le temps presse, oui. Et il y a aussi beaucoup d'enfants qu'on n'entendra jamais.
In addition to the federal hostels for the Inuit and the 2 schools in Fort George, 4 other residential schools were built in Quebec as of the 1950s. Maliotenam, Saint-Marc-de-Figuerie, Mishtiuyats, and Latsuc. Elsewhere in the country, calls had started for the abolition of residential schools. But in Quebec, churches were still campaigning to build them at all costs.
Il y avait encore dans les années 50 énormément de paternalisme dans l'idée qu'ils allaient faire mieux que les parents. Et de toute façon, on voit quand même dans les écrits, dans les archives qu'on peut trouver des différentes congrégations, qu'il y avait encore un mépris très répandu dans la société en général envers les Autochtones.
The children were not spared physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. But deaths would have been rare.
Il n'y a pas plus de ressources qui sont données par le gouvernement fédéral aux pensionnats, mais la santé des enfants semble meilleure, notamment parce qu'il y a eu beaucoup de campagnes de vaccination, et notamment contre la tuberculose.
But the recent discoveries in Kamloops have instilled doubt. Discussions are underway across Quebec on the need to undertake ground searches to find the truth. But another question arises. What if children from Quebec were buried elsewhere, in other provinces? The number of Indigenous children sent to federal hostels and residential schools in Quebec is estimated at 13,000. But many more swelled the ranks at schools in other provinces, especially in Ontario. Kenneth Wischi remembers the moment he was torn from his family in Waskaganish and sent to Northern Ontario.
The government came in with all these chartered planes, we call them, built up all those planes and took the children, all of them, from the community to different residential schools. That was the school program for those children, 5, 6 years old. You know, when I first entered, I was kindergarten, and I didn't know what the hell was going on.
And he wasn't alone.
And at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory.
We were all Cree, mostly Cree children from Moose Factory, Waskaganish, Nemska, East Main, Weemanji, and Chisasibi Cree children. They were all sent to Moose Factory.
Cree children were sent to Moose Factory, Shingwauk, and as far as Brantford. Anishinaabe and Abenaki children were sent across Ontario, Mi'kmaq and Malicites to Nova Scotia. But the first wave of children deported came from the Montreal area.
Dès 1826, les premiers enfants qui ont été envoyés dans les pensionnats dites écoles résidentielles de l'Ontario, c'est les Mohawks.
Eric Pouliot-Teasdale is a Mohawk Innu researcher. He scoured obscure census records and found 3 more waves of children from Kanawake, Kanesatake, and Akwesasne deported well into the next century, all sent to institutions where life was often hard.
L'État ne fournit pas, donc les étudiants sont obligés de devenir en quelque sorte des esclaves industriels, agricoles de la ferme pour s'occuper de leur autosuffisance. Donc, ils vont finalement en classe 1 journée par semaine.
At the time, the mortality rate was 5 times higher than in the general population. At Shingwauk alone, the death registry contains the names of at least 7 children from Quebec, Mohawks for the most part. And the process of identification is still ongoing.
Est-ce qu'il est possible qu'il y ait des enfants comptabilisés dans d'autres provinces, mais qui en fait étaient des enfants qui étaient originaires du Québec et que le chiffre de 38 peut-être ne reflète pas ça?
Ça, c'est très possible.
Raymond Frogner is the head archivist for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. It's his job to complete the archives of the commission, whose mandate ended in 2015. Historical documents from Quebec are limited and pose a unique challenge.
Il y avait un manque de chercheurs qui étaient bilingues, un manque de chercheurs qui ont une connaissance des archives et aussi une connaissance des communautés autochtones.
We obtained a copy of the only report out of Quebec produced for the Commission in 2012. It is but a glimpse into the reality faced by children in Quebec residential schools, and it is yet to be published.
Je sais qu'il faut travailler beaucoup plus au Québec et le CVR ne fait pas assez de temps au Québec. Il faut faire, comme j'ai dit, le rattrapage.
The report demonstrates that much more could be drawn from the archives. For example, this story from an Abenaki child from Quebec en route to Chapleau and Shingwauk residential schools. There were 16 survivors, he says. We were 37, but some died, which calls into question Quebec's official count.
Nous sommes en train de faire la recherche pour trouver beaucoup plus des enfants et cet nombre va sûrement augmenter dans le proche futur.
Oui, ça c'est à Brantford.
Emma Saganash and her siblings spent years in residential schools in Ontario, and one of them never came home.
Moi, j'essaie de me mettre dans dans les mocassins à ma mère. C'est de vivre une horreur de même, là.
Emma Saganash was a pioneer at CBC Radio and Television in the Cree language. She and her 10 brothers and sisters were forced to leave their village of Waswanipi in Quebec. They were all sent to different institutions across Ontario in the 50s and 60s.
Alan puis Caroline étaient à Chinook, en Ontario. Les plus vieux, là, ils ont été à Moose Factory, en Ontario, au Bishop Boarding School. Jane, Louisa puis moi, on était à l'école à Brantford.
Brantford, home of the Mohawk Institute, is the oldest residential school in Canada.
Il y avait une petite chambre en dessous des escaliers, là. J'ai été en punition une fois, ils m'ont enfermée là-dedans pour une couple d'heures, je ne sais pas combien d'heures. Tu sais, quand t'as peur et que t'es jeune, là, hein, c'est dans le noir.
About 100 children died at Brantford. The community has begun the search for unmarked graves.
Ah oui, c'est ça.
The Saganash family long searched for the burial site of their eldest, John. This is the only photo of him. At 6 years old, he was taken from his parents and put on a plane to an unknown destination.
Puis lui, il regardait par la fenêtre, il était assis à la fenêtre, puis il regardait ma mère, puis il grimaçait. Il pleurait. C'est ce que ma mère m'a dit.
John arrived in Moose Factory in 1954. He died several months later. His family was never told how or where he was buried.
J'étais en tournage en 1994 à Moose Factory. Puis il y avait une femme, là, qui courait après moi, qui disait « Emma, j'ai été superviseur de ton frère John. » J'ai été chez eux. Puis le réalisateur qui était avec moi, là, il a décidé « Ah, je vais filmer ça, tu sais. » Elle m'a dit qu'il était malade, qu'il était à l'hôpital, puis qu'il a le rhumatisme. Est-ce qu'il y a du monde qui est malade de ça? Je ne sais pas. J'ai dit, j'aimerais ça aller voir où il est enterré, parce que moi, je ne sais pas. Ma famille ne le sait pas. Fait que j'aimerais ça aller voir. Puis son mari cherchait le nom de 2 grands-mères, puis dans le milieu, supposément que c'était mon frère qui était enterré. Fait que là, ça fait 20 minutes qu'il se promène d'un bord à l'autre, puis j'ai dit à la femme, « C'est quoi le nom de grand-maman? » Fait qu'elle me dit « Clara Small. » Je fais ça sur une pierre tombale. J'ai fait ça. C'était le nom.
You're standing where the grave is. I'm standing where the grave is? Yeah. Hey, that's back
Elle me dit, t'es au-dessus. Ton frère est en dessous de toi. Il était enterré là. Mais il n'y avait pas de marque à rien, là, tu sais. Fait que j'étais comme soulagée un peu. Qu'au moins, je sais où ce qui est enterré. Il est décédé le 6 décembre. La journée, j'ai trouvé où ce qui était enterré, c'était le 6 décembre, 40 ans après.
Emma thought that was the end of the story. But after the discoveries in Kamloops, a former residential school student came forward with a different version of events.
Il y a eu comme un genre de bagarre entre les jeunes garçons. Puis ils l'ont trouvé en bas de la pile. Puis il était tellement plus jeune que d'autres qui étaient là. Puis il m'a dit que le lendemain matin, quand ils se sont levés, on demandé tout le monde de se lever, là, de s'habiller et tout. Lui, il bougeait pas. Mon frère bougeait pas.
John is now on the list of victims, not in Quebec, but in Ontario. It is not known how many children were deported, or how many never returned.
C'est tellement difficile là, que ça fait mal au cœur. Quand tu sais pas. Pour moi, il n'y a pas de fermeture encore.
The Point Bleu Residential School in Meshtiwiats is one of the last to be built in the 1960s.
Ce sont là toutes des belles œuvres que le bon Dieu, notre Père, a faites pour chacun de nous.
These rare archives allow us a glimpse into the daily lives of Quebec residential school children. But we know now that many dark secrets were hidden behind the smiling images. Not surprising, therefore, that the discovery of unmarked graves in the rest of Canada has led many communities to consider ground searches here in Quebec. In Meshtiwiats, officially there are no deaths. But we found a case of at least one child transferred to hospital in Robertval, where he reportedly died. There would be other similar cases.
Ce qu'on suppose, c'est que s'il y avait des enfants malades, ils quittaient le pensionnat et ils étaient envoyés dans des systèmes hospitaliers. Donc s'ils y sont décédés, ce qu'on ne sait pas, il est probable qu'ils n'aient pas été enterrés à côté des pensionnats, mais plutôt à côté de l'institut de santé en question.
There could be painful discoveries around former sanatoriums. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has confirmed that one such institute in the Montreal area is being researched at the moment.
Il y a beaucoup de fosses communes près de cet hôpital et elle travaille avec les sœurs maintenant pour déterminer combien des enfants qui sont là-bas, mais il y en a beaucoup. Je pense qu'à peu près 5 ans au moins.
Because Quebec had fewer residential schools and its schools were built later, deaths and thus unmarked graves would be more rare. In Maliotenam, where officially there's only one death, consultations have not led to new discoveries. The community does not consider ground searches necessary. La Tuque also counts only one official death. But the unpublished report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reveals a second one. In 1969, during a meningitis epidemic that forced the school into quarantine. The community has yet to decide if it will proceed with ground searches. The case of Saint-Marc-de-Figuerie raises questions. No child ever died there according to the official registry. This photo, never before published, seems to prove otherwise. It shows the director of the residential school standing above a coffin next to other students. The Anishinaabe have confirmed that at least 3 children are missing. A ground search is likely. Fort George, where ground searches should begin next summer, will be the first community in Quebec to test its suspicions.
We recognize that this will be painful. It is painful not to know, and it will be painful to learn the truth.
The work will take 2 to 3 years and promises to be complex due to the uneven terrain and the vegetation that has reclaimed the land.
Where they lie is sacred ground. It is up to us to bless it in their memories.
The residential school is over there.
At the age of 7, Kenneth returned to Quebec to attend a residential school in Fort George. he remembers a boy who fell ill at the Anglican school, St. Philip's, in the 60s.
That boy from Waskaganish must have been about 8 years old, maybe. What I remember when I'm being here, okay, he died here in that residential school because he was very cold, shivers and everything.
His name does not appear on the official list. Through testimonials, by searching articles, archives, and historical records, we have identified 4 unaccounted cases at St. Philip's and 8 more at the Catholic residential school. Disease killed many children in the early years, according to one historian with the Grey Nuns.
Elle indique qu'il y avait à peu près 2 ou 3 enfants qui mouraient par année. Donc, si on fait le décompte du nombre d'années qu'a duré le pensionnat de Fort George, on arrive assez vite à des chiffres qui dépassent la trentaine.
Janie Pachano is amongst the last remaining survivors who can still bear witness. The memory that haunts her is that of Ellen Bobish.
It was after lunch, and after every meal we were supposed to go outside immediately. She was sitting there on the floor when I came into the playroom. She had her legs up, her knees, holding herself like this with her head on her knees. The supervisor came in and started yelling at her. Get up, get dressed, go outside. She said, I can't. I said, I told you to get up, go outside. I can't, I'm sick. Went over, started kicking her on the side. And she kind of went like this, and I was kicking her in the back, and she finally just kept sliding over to the door. Finally kicked her outside. The girl was lying there in a fetal position. And this was in February. And it's very cold out in February up here. A few days later, they announced that she had died. And they said, don't you talk about this, she's gone. Don't talk about this anymore.
Each potential new case we have found will require scrupulous research before being confirmed and added to the official list. But much points to a revised and updated list of victims of residential schools in Quebec. If the searches lead to new discoveries, the next steps could prove difficult.
It's just the belief that we have, that you should not disturb the graves once they've been set. If you're going to trample on it, you're disturbing it, especially if you're going to dig around in certain areas where people have been buried. I think it makes it very hard.
Will they exhume the bodies? If so, will they ever be able to identify the remains? It's another chapter in a story for which the end remains unwritten. And it's a process that is calling on the resilience of former students and survivors across the province, both Inuit and First Nations.
You grow up and survive all of this, you don't want to remember. You want to keep it hidden. You want to bury it somewhere so you'll forget, but you can't forget.
These memories, impossible to forget, now belong to our collective history.
Nous sommes ce que nous avons choisi à se souvenir, mais nous sommes aussi ce que nous avons choisi à oublier. Et maintenant, je pense que c'est le temps de faire une reconnaissance et se souvenir qu'est-ce qui se passe dans les pensionnats.
We recognize that these children's lives were taken at a place where they were supposed to be protected and loved. And we owe it to them and to their families and those who love them to honor them with the dignity that they always deserved.